Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I am joined by the host of the Risk of Ruin podcast, John Reeder. John, thank you very much for coming on. The Business of Betting podcast is proudly brought to you by the Betfair Hub from Betfair Australia. No matter where you are in the world, if you want expert articles from pro punters, from building automated models to betting psychology, check out the Betfair Hub. betfair.com.au/hub. Gamble responsibly. Today I am joined by the host of the Risk of Ruin podcast, John Reeder. John, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I stumbled across your show a while back now, and each episode is fascinating, from typical casino advantage play through to points and miles and getting new credit cards to find an edge there. And I think your Twitter handle kind of summed it up, at Half Kelly on Twitter, and just the nature of things we've discussed over the years on podcasts fits in really well with what you're doing. So it's going to be fun to dig into some of that. And I'm just curious, how did you get led into the podcast gambling space? Because it's usually a place where there's only negative feedback and it's really hard to be interesting. And you've obviously broken a few of those barriers already.
Oh, well, thank you. So I'm basically just like a small-time recreational gambler. We live in Southern California, so we go to Vegas, semi-regularly or maybe a number of times per year. And so we would just go and I would, play recreational, and never probably not since I've been 20 years old or something, have I bet an amount that I would even notice at the end of the year. But I did notice that, the more I went, the more uncomfortable I became with losing. And so I didn't like that part of it. And I also, I have kind of a mind where I like to work on things. And then the other thing was just being in the casino, I have a real problem with authority. So I don't like it if I feel like I'm at a disadvantage, that conflicts with the part of my personality that has a problem with authority. And so I started to learn how to count cards. And so that was the thing. I just thought, well, if I learn how to count cards, it'll hopefully, number one is I won't have to think that if I'm in the casino, I'm only an underdog. And also it'll give me something to do in the casino, because it's more of an activity. You're not just sitting in front of a slot machine pushing a button. So I did that. I started to learn how to count cards. At first I did it on my own. And then eventually I joined up with Blackjack Apprenticeship, and that actually was somewhat helpful just because they have it's so streamlined the way that they teach you there. And so then I did that. I just go out and, if we're on vacation, I go out and I count cards, like the people we travel with will play, slot machines, and my wife will play other table games, and I'll, count cards or do other things in the casino where, at least I don't feel like I'm at a disadvantage. And that's kind of how I got started. But I've always kind of been like, just the way my brain works, I'm always interested in things like, come up with a hypothesis, make a prediction, and then, deal with the fallout of whether you were right or wrong. Like that's just the part of thinking that naturally appeals to me. So like over the years, I've done things like, like a few years ago, I was into shorting Tesla, which probably will sound crazy to anybody, but this was actually at a time when you weren't purely getting your face ripped off from shorting Tesla. And I actually had made money doing it. And I had actually traded both long and short Tesla, but mostly short. But I did notice that as it went on, I noticed that there was so little correlation between what I expected to happen in terms of the price action and then what would actually happen, that eventually I just stopped because I realized I didn't have an edge doing it. And so I just said, it doesn't make any sense to just go out here and basically flip coins against the market. And so I did that. And then also I'll say my job, like my wife always says that my job is basically gambling. So I I sell land to developers, and so the things like monetary outcomes that can swing wildly, having to make a prediction, and then if you are right, you make money, and if you're wrong, you lose money. That's sort of part of my everyday life.
It seems like there's so many more industries than I certainly thought growing up, which is basically gambling. You just talked about then, but obviously a lot of the Wall Street stuff and trading, and some of those areas can be just straight out gambling, and others can be sort of risk adjusted is what you hear all the time, and you can sort of have caps on liability and stuff like that. But it is interesting that more and more we get into fields that are straight gambling. But tell me a little bit more about when you're on vacation and you want to spend time in a casino. I'm guessing a lot of people out there will probably see that time as fun time, as vacation time, and let's go and throw some chips on the craps table and see if we can, hit a hard 8 a few times or some of that type of thing. But it seems like the mindset to want to do that on vacation, it obviously clearly permeates through not only your, everyday life and everyday trips to a casino, but the fun times you can still have an advantage maybe or break even on card counting, and that's something you want to do.
Yeah. And I always have to have something to do. So it's like, if I'm just sitting there, I'll be bored. And I can sort of pretend like I'm having fun. And I've done all that stuff before. I've played craps, and had fun doing it, or whatever. I mean, almost every game in the casino I've played, just for recreation. But it just got to a point where I just wasn't, it just wasn't very interesting to me anymore. And so then, it's like, I will say it's somewhat odd to go out and do some of these things, when you're with people and they're there for recreation, and you go count cards and you get backed off and they ask you to not play. They say, no more blackjack. And then the people you're with have somewhat of an odd reaction to that. And so, and there are times where I have to be somewhat careful, because it's like, we might be somewhere and everybody else is there to have fun. And if I get asked to leave, that's not going to be fun for everybody. So I do have to be somewhat careful about that. But it's just, I guess the only way I can put it is it's something to do.
Fair enough. No, it's a good point. So tell me about learning to count cards, because I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about how they actually go about doing it. I mean, I'm guessing you read books and then you get a deck of cards out at home and you start practicing the counting stuff. But tell me how you learnt, and also, do you find utility in that in other parts of your life outside of just being able to use it at the table?
Well, sort of. Let me answer the first part. Now that there's software for everything, it's like incredibly easy to learn to count cards. I mean, I would never have done it probably if I had to get out a physical deck of cards and actually count. But it's like, I have an app on my phone that where I can, if I have 5 minutes, I can sit there and play blackjack and count cards. So that part is pretty easy. There's this blackjack apprenticeship. The actual counting is super easy. It's, +1, -1, +1, -1. And then you have to do a little bit of simple division just to get from, what they call a running count to a true count. And then after that, it's really mostly memorization and basically muscle memory. So the actual learning is not that difficult. Anybody could learn. They say that, you could teach a monkey to count cards. That's not the difficult part. It's all of the other stuff that goes with card counting that's difficult. And the people that do it professionally, they have to deal with lots of challenges that aren't really related to just the counting. So that's how I learned, is just with software. And now, as far as has it helped anything else, I think probably just understanding how much risk even advantage gamblers have to deal with is probably the biggest thing that I've learned through card counting. Because, if you have let's say you have a very small edge of like 1 and 1.5%, well, you're basically flipping coins against the house, right? Like, and you can lose a lot of coin flips. So the swings on something like that, if you have a small edge, will be dramatic. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing. And that would go with anything, if you're betting sports, but you have a very small edge, you're going to have dramatic swings. And so I'd say that that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned from card counting, where you can apply it to something else. You can know that on any game where you have a small edge, there are going to be a lot of losses.
Would you ever suggest to someone to have that skill set in their back pocket, either to use it on vacation or work trips when they're at casinos or nearby casinos or staying in casinos, or is it something that's maybe left to a certain kind of person who, is inclined that way to learn that skill and actually use it?
Well, I mean, it sort of depends, right? Like, I mean, it kind of depends on what kind of person you are. Because it's not that difficult to do. I mean, and it's also not expensive to do. Like the app that I use, I think it's like $6 or something, and that will get you, it will at least get you to like basic competency, so that you actually know kind of what things are, and then from there you could decide how serious you want to get. But I will say this, the other people that I know I do this have zero interest in doing it. It's like if we're at a casino, they're like, yeah, knock yourself out with, whatever you think you're doing. We'll be over here having fun, So I think that it would be, it really kind of depends on the kind of person you are.
Yeah, I'm guessing part of a lot of people tell me the reason we're wired to gamble is that something's at risk. It's not necessarily winning and or losing that drives us. It's the fact that something's at risk. And I think going into a casino and card counting and having a between 1% edge and 1% negative, depending how well you do it, that element of why we do things may be lost a little bit. Do you find that it's a different experience, let's say card counting versus doing some other stuff in the casino?
Well, I think for most people, they would just find it to be miserable. I think most people would just think like, this is not a fun thing. But for me, it's like, it's not fun for me to sit there and know that, if I play long enough, the house is going to win, right? Like that to me is like not very fun. But also, so because there's other things you can do in a casino, like a lot of people now play machines. And they're not that hard to figure out. And I'm not like a professional machine player at all, but I have sat down at machines where, it looked like, probably there's some edge to be had. And I did that, I've done that with my wife. And afterwards she said, I will never do that again. That was terrible. So I think that it just depends on the kind of person you are.
So I want to dig into observations from your podcast and all the different guests you've had on so far. But before we get into some specifics, tell me what your expectations were going into the podcast itself. Did you have anything either you wrote down or thought as to A, why you might be doing this, or B, what you might get out of it?
No, not at all. I basically just did it because I was bored. This was the start of the COVID quarantine, and I think I'd been at home for a month or two, and I was just bored out of my mind. And the real estate market was just not very active at that time, so there wasn't really hardly anything to do. And I had always been interested in podcasting, but I have an obsessive personality, so once I started counting cards, I went back and I listened to like every episode of Gambling with an Edge. And I know you just had Richard Munchkin on before. But I listened to like almost every episode. And so I knew the episodes, and I have a fairly good memory, and I kind of knew where a lot of the good stories are. And so I thought for the first episode, all I did was really make it was like a tribute to Gambling with an Edge. That was my first episode. And I thought, well, this will be something at least that will keep me busy. And it did for a couple months. And so I did that. And then afterwards, I thought, well, I don't know what to do next. And I think I maybe suggested to Richard Munchkin that I would make another episode, maybe about he and his friends that played blackjack in the 80s. And so then I started doing that. But no, I didn't really have any expectations, I don't have any expectations. It's like, kind of a thing that keeps me busy. It's a fun thing to do. It's actually really fun to talk to the people because, there's such a diversity of the people I've been able to talk to, and that's been really fun. So no, I don't really have any expectations, and I have no idea what. Well, I've told people a couple times, like, the median outcome for this is I make 20 episodes and then find something else that catches my eye, and I start working on something else.
Fair enough. I can say similar thoughts actually when I started this, and my median wasn't 20, it was probably 3, so I'm slightly above 3 at this point, so that makes me feel somewhat good. But I found a few different themes out of your show, and I don't know if you'll agree with all of them, but I wanted to get your sense on some of them. And the first one, which comes along with gambling, the good, the bad, the winning, the losing, is addiction, and the just the general obsessive nature that comes with the people involved in gambling, whether it's like I said, there's someone losing at a table and they couldn't be dragged away for anything really, or the winning side, which you've obviously talked to that sort of group, or those on that part of the spectrum. So just, did you have any pre-existing thoughts that the types of people you're going to come and have onto the show and talk about gambling were going to be in that way? Because even some of the stories of outside of gambling, I think the one that comes to mind is the guy that was basically living in his car and driving around, and then he'd go make some money inside the casinos and maybe make some money to stay at a hotel and so on. Like, there's some crazy stories that come out of the gambling world.
Yeah, and actually it's probably a good sign. I actually can't tell which of the guests you're talking about, because there was one guy, I interviewed one guy, his name is Dan, and he lives in a van, one of these converted Sprinter vans, and he basically plays connect the dots with casinos, drives to different casinos, counts cards, moves on to the next place. And then one of the other people I interviewed was this guy, Mickey Krim, and Mickey Krim's like pretty well known in, online advantage slot world. He's like he's probably the internet's most famous slot hustler. And yeah, he was, basically living out of a sleeping bag before he found Advantage Play. And then even after he found it, he basically has lived in hotels his whole life. So there are some very different kinds of people that you come across when you start interviewing some of these gamblers. I think, probably the one personality trait, like I don't know that I've really picked up on a number of personality traits that gamblers might share, but I do think that there's one which is a low, they assign a low importance to like societal norms. And I think that's kind of the one trait. But in terms of obsession, there's this book, I think it's called The Professor, the Banker, and the Suicide King. And it's about these famous poker matches that happened, 2003 or so, something like that. And in that book, I think that they say that the poker players admit that they're basically just degenerate gamblers who found something that they could win at. And I don't think that describes all professional gamblers, but I do think that describes some professional gamblers where they have, they have gamble in them, and they find an edge that basically lets them become functioning. And I think that, some gamblers that would apply more to, and then some gamblers it would apply less to. But I've also talked to people who, they will underbet their bankroll because they like that they can sleep at night if they play under what their bankroll would let them bet. So I don't think it's like a universal thing at all, but I think certainly there is something there where there's a tendency to gamble, and then they kind of get it under control by finding an advantage.
Yeah, I think one thing that's come up a few times is just this idea of having caught the gambling bug or the disease or however it's described, and I think you're right. I think some people can satisfy that by either being a bookmaker and being in and around all the action and the activity, and they get their fix, for want of a better term, in that way, or they work within the field of gambling in some related way, and they no longer necessarily need to be placing bets all the time to feel that emotion. And I think it's probably true. I think the functioning part of it's interesting because you pick up and drop some of these people into other areas where they don't have an advantage, and you often see it spiral. And you see really successful, smart people have those experiences and those examples outside of the worlds that they're good at. Whether it's, you hear the story of plenty of poker players that try sports and haven't done very well. You hear the Wall Street guys who have made, hundreds of millions, tens of millions, flying out to Atlantic City or Vegas and staying in casinos and obviously playing games that they obviously would know they're not going to have an advantage at and losing. And maybe they're happy to do that and they call it entertainment, and losing 5 million and some of these whales losing more is part of their happy lifestyle. But I think you're right, that whole mentality of the gambler, and depending on what situation you put them in, you can call them two totally different things. In one situation, they're a top half of 1%, genius at that gambling game, and then you put them in other situations and they're just like the rest of us.
Yeah. And I wouldn't know, I could never be able to say how prevalent it is, but it's just something that you can see exists, and I wouldn't know if it's 1% or 99% of gamblers that fit into that mold.
And the underbetting example, like the whole idea of tolerance to risk is an interesting one, and it is fascinating that certain people can go through periods of time overbetting and losing because they're overbetting even with an edge, and they can have that cycle continue, and others who'll underbet their edge and, like you said, they want to sleep at night. Is that something else that came out of the show with even I think it comes through mannerisms and it comes through personality, even being able to talk to people. I've found over the years that certain people you can, maybe, you don't get it 100% right, but you can say, well, I think this person's in this direction. Or oftentimes I'd finish a podcast episode with someone and my wife would say, how did that go? Or what was that person like? And I would imagine there's, with some certainty, you can put your finger on how they would approach risk and what type of tolerance they might have.
Yeah, and I think that one thing is, I haven't done an episode about poker yet, but I probably will soon. But I think that you would somewhat have to break things up based on what games they're playing and what the culture is around that game, because, there are some gambling endeavors where, like, for instance, poker players almost universally overbet their bankroll, right? Because they know that getting staked by other poker players is a part of the culture, right? So they might overbet their own personal bankroll, knowing that they can get somebody to take a piece of them, and then they can get back in the game, right? Whereas for blackjack players, I think it would be a lot less common to overbet your bankroll, because they know that it's just not going to be. So if they overbet their bankroll and, let's say, go broke, they could get someone to stake them. But the problem there is, now when you go out and start playing again, you have an investor you have to pay. You have to play at a table limit where you're going to draw attention. And it's just not going to work out that well, because you're going to get, you'll get barred playing at the higher limit so that you can also pay your investor. So it doesn't have the same, the risk is quite a bit different than for a poker player. So I think that different gamblers will have a different view of that risk and a different view of how much they should, what percentage of their bankroll they should be betting. But then also, I've talked to, Bob Dancer. He was a video poker player, or he is a video poker player, and he made a lot of his money in the 90s. And he basically admits that in a lot of cases he was overbetting his bankroll, and sometimes he knew he was overbetting his bankroll, but he just thought, well, I'll take a shot, and if it works out, then great, and if it doesn't work out and I lose, I'll set a stop loss limit for myself, and then I'll quit. And then sometimes he was just overbetting his bankroll because at that time, they didn't quite understand how much variance was in the game and how to even calculate how much bankroll you needed. So I think it's a pretty interesting topic, because, if you talk to any professional gambler, they would say, well, you have to follow the math, you have to go where the numbers take you, you have to be disciplined. And then, and not very much time after that, they would admit that at some point they've overbet their bankroll, which is essentially admitting that in addition to following the math and being disciplined, they were also hoping to get lucky. I think that is like, and it's in, maybe it's not in every gambler story, but it's in a lot of gambler stories.
Yeah, I think absolutely the human element of it all, because you can usually distill some of this or even all of this when it comes to certain, closed system games where there is an answer for a lot of things. I mean, maybe not in sports and horse racing and stuff like that, but a lot of these games, there is a generally correct answer or a best practice. And yeah, the human element always seems to creep in no matter who it is or what it is or where it is. There's always an element of that. I remember hearing Bob talk about that stuff and just thinking, like, there was probably scenarios, and he can obviously answer this better than I could, but there might have been scenarios where he would have put himself in a position to be either substantially wiped out or fully wiped out or go back to close to zero in some instances. And I think that risk tolerance is kind of going back to what you were talking about before, where some people are just very willing to go down those paths sometimes, even when they have an advantage, even when they're doing a lot of things right. They'll still allow themselves to be a little loose in certain instances. And I think it just goes to the point that there is scientific style ways of doing this stuff, and always the human element seems to want to creep back in because of the bug, of the disease, of the obsessive nature of gamblers, depending on what situation you put them in.
Well, and I guess another thing that I think is probably worth mentioning is that there's probably a difference just in terms of the mentality of playing the actual game. So like if you talk to, like, there is no ego involved in beating the game of blackjack, right? Because it's so mechanical, what you do. However, and so yeah, maybe you would have maybe the idea of beating the house, you would get off on that a little bit. But if you play poker, well, now the person you're beating is like sitting across the table from you or sitting on the other side of the computer. And so there's going to be ego involved in that. And I think that the different ways that would work would also change the way that you saw taking a shot. So for instance, I don't know, I'll be interested to hear when eventually I get to a poker episode, but I think the idea of achievement and achieving a higher level, so going from something like, playing 10-20 no limit hold'em to playing 3,000, 6,000 no limit hold'em, that the way that would impact, your perception of your skills would be very important and would probably make you more likely to want to take shots to prove to yourself that you could do those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one other thing I wanted to ask around this topic is, do you get a true sense of why you think these people are happy to follow this lifestyle, let's say? Because in many instances, people will say, yeah, I do it for the money. Money is a scoreboard. If I have more money than you or someone else gambling or everyone else in the state, city, country, whatever it is, then I can say objectively that I'm successful. But there's plenty of examples where people aren't living in 9-bedroom homes, to the opposite end, where they're still happy to live in a hotel room or sleep in the back of their car on the road, even when they might have, enough money from gambling winnings. I sense there's some element of this where money isn't the main or key driver to a lot of this, and there's something else at play that allows someone to grind their way through, that example you mentioned before of dots on the map to casino. Like it's not a splashy, sexy way to live. And if it's not for the money or for the fame, or you're not beating another poker player or beating, the NFL markets, then there's got to be something else intuitively involved or some, human nature element. And maybe it's the, some of the stuff you talked about that is interesting to you earlier on with being able to work on things and solve problems and tasks. And maybe you hate the casinos and the pit boss and the authority that comes with those guys, standing around having the ability to shut you down or turn you away. Do you get a sense that some gamblers are driven in a non-monetary way?
Well, I always say, even before I did this podcast, I always say that money is not a sufficient explanation for why people do anything. And I think that a lot of the stories in these episodes really prove that, because And gambling is a great example because it seems like it should be about money, right? Like it's a pretty gambling crystallizes the relationship between like prediction and money so well. However, I think that if you look at so many of these people could have made a lot more money doing something else. And maybe some of them couldn't, like it's like, some gamblers have done so well from gambling that, probably they couldn't have made more money doing something else. But a lot of these people could have made more money doing something else. And so I think that for a lot of them, not having a boss is a pretty valuable thing. And I think that for a lot of them, it comes down to that is basically, there's nobody who is going to tell you what to do, and you can work as hard or not as hard as you want to on any problem that you have. So I do think that I don't think that I don't think that the money really is a very good explanation for why gamblers do what they do.
Another area that pops up is a lot of the foundational stories.
Oh, and actually, I had one more thing to mention about that is I think that if you look at it, you can see the signs that some of these professional gamblers get into gambling thinking, well, this will be the thing, this will be like the thing that I've always wanted my life to be. And they have some success and do very well for themselves, and then eventually figure out that there are other things that they want their life to be. One of the card counters I talked to, he was like obsessed with card counting, did really well. In his first year, got up to the point where he could bet table max, really anywhere he went, which is, I mean, you have to have a pretty large bankroll to be betting table max. And then decided that he wanted to have, a small company. I can't remember. I think he might be selling coffee, but something like that. And then, other, I interviewed this guy, Daryl Purpose, and he, said, when he was in his early 20s, he was obsessed with card counting. And when he was in his 30s, he was obsessed with being a musician. So I think that some of these people get into it thinking like, this will be the thing that will make my life what I want it to be. And then I think that some of them realize that, no, actually there's other things that I want my life to be as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that hollowness or emptiness of, well, I'm beating this game, I'm beating this market, I'm beating this sport or whatever it is, can expire for some people. And I've heard plenty of people talk about the idea of not being able to add anything back to society really when it comes to gambling. A lot of times there's no value add there that they can point to and rely on and say, well, this was worthwhile because of this. Because like you said, if money's not enough or money's not a primary factor or main component, then there's not a lot left behind always. And it probably goes to your examples there where certain people are happy to walk away, even if it's a plus EV benefit to their bank type approach. But at the end of the day, there's so much more that goes into it for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of the foundational stories, at least through your show and in talking to other people, in terms of finding their edge, it seems like they went to a library and printed out a lot of materials and read about it and found their way through different opportunities, or they learned how to count cards and maybe they spent a bit of time practicing and joined a group or those types of things. But I think if you ask the average person on the street, they would say it'd be too hard to figure out how to find an edge. And I think it sort of made me realize that maybe the opportunity and assessing what areas you can make money isn't necessarily going to be the hardest thing in areas like casino play, because I think there's certainly a stigma out there that you cannot ever possibly win inside of a casino. But I think your show at least opened up the idea that may not be the biggest problem is finding that edge. It's more down the other things that can stop you from making some money.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to depend on what you're doing, because you can walk into almost any casino and start counting cards, and they're at some point, somewhere between 15 minutes and a few hours, they'll figure out what you're up to, and they'll tell you to leave. So that's one thing. I mean, that's not hard. But for some of the other things that these people do, it is a lot harder. And they have to either break down the math of the game, which isn't easy. Some of these, they call them carnival games. The math isn't super easy to break down, and so they have to break down the math and figure out where the advantage is, or they have to figure out, how to get some piece of information that the casino doesn't want you to have, like what the dealer's hole card is. And so that's not going to be super easy. But I think the thing that I've been most impressed with, and this is really listening to Gambling with an Edge and then some of the people that I've talked to, is the amount of creativity that goes into these plays. And the one that I think is really, every time I think about it, I'm like, wow, I really can't believe that they did that. But, back in the 80s, they had this thing that was based on learning how to cut a certain number of cards. I don't know if you've heard at all about this, but basically the dealer would shuffle the cards. This would be like a single deck game. The dealer would shuffle the cards. Today they cover up that bottom card. They put a cut card over it so you can't see it. But at this time, they would flash the bottom card to the players. The players at the table would figure out, okay, if it's a 5 or a 6, we're going to cut that to the 13th card and stick it to the dealer's down card. And so they would sit in their apartments and learn how to cut exactly 13 cards so they could cut a bad card to the dealer. And that to me is like, number one is it's creative to think like, we're going to take advantage of the fact that they're flashing this bottom card to us, but also it would take quite a bit of practice to learn how to cut that. So that's the one to me where I think like, these people really have sort of scary creative minds and a good amount of obsession to learn how to actually follow through on this advantage. So that's kind of the thing, is I think that it requires a good amount of creativity, and then you also have to be rigorous in assessing whether or not this advantage that you're planning on is actually real, because it would be very easy. There are like bad ideas for advantage play out there too that involve, getting a look at a card that's not that valuable. And so you would still have to be rigorous to determine whether the edge that you're planning on having is going to be a real one.
Well, it reminds me of I think it was David Blaine on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about, and I have no idea if this is true. I'm guessing there's a chance that it's not true, or a good chance, or whatever, but a kid who from an early age had a roulette table in his house, a craps table in his house, and learned how to throw to die to land on certain numbers on purpose after practicing, I think, for 10 or 15 years, and then having a job in a casino and working on a craps table, and then is out there now basically rolling whatever numbers he wants on a craps table, which, seems far-fetched, but I think if that's on one end of the scale, and maybe, basic, strategy or counting cards on the other end, there's so much in between there, and it seems like, there's so many interesting people out there who are trying to find all sorts of different edges that we would probably never stumble across and think would be crazy and whatever else, but they're creative enough to come up with a lot of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the craps example is a great example of one where, that's a very obvious idea to, try to get good at rolling dice. There's probably a lot of people out there that would think that it's possible. But then the difference between, is that a real advantage or are you just bullshitting yourself? I think that is where the real advantage players are made. And there have been a number of guys over the years who have said, we believe that we can beat craps. And, the list of credible stories is a very, very short list, or maybe close to non-existent. And so, I think that a lot of the advantage players think that really probably craps, beating it that way is not the way that you would beat it. By rolling, learning how to roll the dice is not the way that you would beat craps.
It's fascinating. And like I said, I have no idea how true it is, but it gets the juices flowing. So one final area I wanted to talk to you about was just the real world, and, taking these types of people that you talk to and I talk to, and how they operate and function within their own sort of gambling worlds, but, using that in real life and in the real world. Have you found many ideas or concepts or strategies or approaches from listening to these people talk for hours and trying to apply them, or are there things we can take or learn from these types of people and benefit from them in non-gambling ways?
Yeah, so I think there's probably, well, first let me just give like a concrete idea. Like this would be like if you're looking for an easy way to get an advantage, here would be a way to do it. And that is, very often people think about beating the actual game. So like if it's, becoming good at poker or learning how to count cards or becoming good at sports betting or whatever it might be. So they're become very focused on beating the game and put a lot of time and energy into beating the game when they might be a lot better off trying to figure out how to beat the marketing department at whatever it is that they're doing. So if it's a casino, that casino probably has promotions and things that could be targeted. Or if it's like credit cards, that's, you're basically taking advantage of the marketing department there. And really some of the biggest and best wins ever have come from taking on the marketing department, not the actual game. So, when internet gambling first came out, I had this guy, Daryl Purpose, and Richard Munchkin, I think he was doing this as well at the time, but, they were basically, I think, taking advantage of the deposit bonuses on these gaming sites. And Daryl told me that he bought a laptop and made $1 million sitting in a Starbucks. He didn't have Wi-Fi at his house. He didn't have Wi-Fi at his house, but he made $1 million going to Starbucks to take advantage of these internet casinos. And that is, you can almost go through the list of big wins and almost, not always, but very often find that actually it was the marketing department that was being taken advantage of. There was this guy, Don Johnson, in Atlantic City, and he had won so much from Atlantic City casinos that I think he got the CEO of the Tropicana in Atlantic City fired. I think that's how much he won. It was like $12 or $13 million. But the way he did it was taking advantage of loss rebates. And then, I just did this episode with these travel hackers, and, they just go after the points and miles promotions from these credit cards and the travel companies. So just in terms of a concrete example of what people could look at to try to get an advantage is look at the marketing department and try to think about what are the ways that this promotion could give me an advantage in whatever.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that's a concrete example. But then I think also in terms of just mentality, the one thing that I've noticed that gamblers could probably teach the rest of us a lesson about is learning how to take your licks, because they have to learn how to lose, and so over time they're able to develop thick skin from learning how to lose, and so learning how to take your lumps I think is a big thing, and also learning how to do the hard things. So the hard thing is not to learn how to count cards. That's like pretty easy. The hard thing is, how do you deal with when you're on the road for a month and you're staying in crappy hotel rooms and you're losing? That's the hard thing. And so I think for most things that we do, we mistake the easy thing for the hard thing. But I think that gamblers really are very good at identifying the hard thing, and then they become good at the hard thing. So that would be the other thing.
Awesome. So the podcast is called Risk of Ruin, and it's everywhere you get your podcast. @HalfKelly on Twitter. John, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to chat. Do you have any upcoming episodes you can share a sneak peek on, or any broader plans, or is it just 1 week at a time?
Yeah, I'm still trying to decide what the next episode is going to be. So if anybody had any suggestions for episodes, reach out to me on Twitter, or you can email the show riskofruinpod@gmail.com.
Amazing, John. It's been a pleasure, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you.